So this video might be a little bit controversial because I'm going to be giving you 5 signs you are not an INTJ. And I feel in comparison to mistyped INFJs, and correct me if I'm wrong, people with the INTJ label might feel a little bit more protective of it. It's a label that tends to epitomize strength. It tends to give people a kind of identity that says, I can do anything that I want to do. I mean, just look at typical INTJ descriptions: the mastermind, the architect. Let's be honest, who wouldn't want to be an INTJ? At least, who wouldn't want to be an INTJ according to typical type descriptions? Well, yeah, the INTJ personality type is absolutely incredible, but to be honest, so are all of the 15 others. Do not rely upon your type code to tell you who you are and what you can and cannot do. Instead, use your type code to tell you how to do the things you want to do. And I've got to admit, next to the INFJ, for which I've already made a video of this format, and I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already, I do consider the INTJ to be the second most mistyped of them all. And I've got to say, I do not blame people for mistyping as INTJs. Because the fact is, many people are introverted, intuitive thinking, judging types. You can correspond to these MBTI dichotomies and not have the corresponding cognitive functions of an INTJ. Because plenty of particularly NI-activated and driven ISTPs, plenty of particularly more conscientious and therefore receiving a judging score INTPs, plenty of INFJs who identify more with their thinking function than their feeling function, of which, by the way, there are many and I stand among their number. And my personal favourite of all, particularly introverted and open, intuitive ESTJs, can all fall very neatly within the introverted, intuitive thinking, judging dichotomy. And let's be honest, when you search for a specific cognitive function online, the accompanying descriptions are so vague that an ESTJ, for example, can still mistype as an NI dominant. So yeah, I'm not going to be using the dichotomies for this video, because you can be reclusive and solitary, not necessarily people-oriented, very open and very creative, and very big picture-oriented, in every way preferring cold and hard logic, whatever that means, over feeling itself, and be highly conscientious and industrious, without having the corresponding cognitive functions of a true INTJ. So with that all out of the way, let's dive into the video. But before I do so, I just want to recommend to anyone watching this who hasn't already done so to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it. That way you can stay notified of future content. And as much as I've spent the last 5 minutes complaining about the MBTI dichotomies and why we cannot use them in helping you determine whether or not you are an INTJ, there is actually one dichotomy we can use. And this is the introversion versus extroversion spectrum. But I'm not talking about introversion in the sense of preferring alone time. Not even in the sense of being less sociable than another person. Because honestly, there were many ENTPs, for example, who need a lot of alone time. There were plenty of ESTJs who do not consider themselves particularly sociable. And there are actually many INTJs who are, by contrast, particularly action-oriented. So yeah, I'm not going to be using a behavioral definition of introversion versus extroversion for this video, and rather present to you a cognitive definition of introversion versus extroversion. And in determining whether or not your dominant cognition is more introverted than extroverted, it is a simple matter of determining the extent to which you are more cognitively proactive, that is, cognitively not behaviorally, over cognitively reactive. Because if you are in fact an INTJ, it is very unlikely the majority of your time will be spent reacting against the external world. It is very unlikely your ideal state of flow where you feel most comfortable and relaxed entails an extensive and prolonged interaction with an external medium. Because don't get me wrong, every type is cognitively proactive and cognitively reactive. It is simply a matter of determining which of these extremes you lean more towards. And while I've already made a separate video on cognitive introversion versus cognitive extroversion, and I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already, I will now go into a little bit more depth in order to help you determine whether or not you are more cognitively proactive, that is introverted, than reactive. So when you think of the term cognitive proactivity, don't picture somebody being high in initiative. No, when I say cognitive proactivity, I'm talking about somebody who spends a lot more time internalizing an outcome than they do actually realizing it. Because when an INTJ, being as they are a cognitive introvert, is engaged with a task, unless it is particularly engrossing and demands every single little bit of their attention, they are still going to be internalizing the outcome. And it is not uncommon in the slightest bit, particularly when it concerns more menial tasks, for example, that don't necessarily take a lot of attention, for an INTJ, even when they are reacting against the external world, be it through a creative medium or something more practical, not to say those two things are mutually exclusive, of course, they will still find themselves engrossed in a highly internal dialogue, even in some instances when the task is particularly automated, for example, egoistically dissociating themselves from external reality. But these two extremes of proactivity and reactivity are not a binary. It is not either or. Every single individual has both of these at the same time. It is simply that the INTJ, being as they are a cognitive introvert, will spend more time in and egoistically identify more with a cognitively proactive state than they would a cognitively reactive state. As opposed to, say, an ENTJ or an ENTP, an ESTJ, all of which can be completely cognitively immersed in the external. They could be finding new connections upon a musical instrument. They could be spending hours upon hours going down a rabbit hole of research, almost entirely losing themselves in the process. And of course, just as an ENTP, for example, can spend time in a cognitively proactive state, the INTJ can of course lose themselves within an act, find themselves within the flow, as some people like to say. But even when an INTJ is engaged with an external medium, there will still be a certain cognitive magnetism pulling the INTJ back towards their internal reality. And being an introverted intuitive dominant in particular, the vast majority of INTJs will find themselves in a kind of pull and tug between the internal and external world. For as much as they want to fully engage with the present moment, fully focus upon the task at hand, after a short burst of external activity, will find themselves begin to tire out as they continue to try and resist the pull towards their internal world. And it is this proactive nature that can make the external activity very tiring to the INTJ. And as such, an INTJ will be much more conservative with their external expenditure, oftentimes only engaging in a more cognitively reactive state in short bursts. And even when they are in such a state, still being pulled back towards the sanctum, if you like, of their introverted intuitive landscape. And as such, if you are more cognitively reactive than you are cognitively proactive, and can engage fully with an external medium, be it a creative pursuit or otherwise, as you seek to, for example, discover new patterns or innovate or be industrious, without feeling after an hour or two this innate pull back towards an internal sanctum, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ. Because while of course an INTJ can do all of these things, they will still feel an innate pull back towards the confines of their internal world. And even when they are engaged in such a task, they are oftentimes yo-yoing between an internal reflective dialogue and the task they are engaged with externally. And this leads me neatly to point number 2. The INTJ is an introverted intuitive dominant. This pertains to more than just having introverted intuition, because if that was the case, every type would be an INTJ. And I just want to clear something up about this too. It is possible to be very competent, very introspective, very deep in your thought process, and very future-oriented, and generally good at achieving the visions you set out to achieve without being an introverted intuitive dominant. Contrary to what many people seem to believe, that is not the criteria for being an INTJ. No, introverted intuition as a dominant function is something much more personal than that. It cannot be ascertained by simply how good you are at X and Y. Because yeah, there are associations with being an introverted intuitive dominant, but it's possible, for example, both extroverted intuitive dominants to meet those particular criteria, to have those associated behaviors. And introverted intuition isn't something you necessarily communicate to other people, as much as experience within your own world. And this is particularly the case with the INTJ. And I'm going to say the implications of being an NI dominant in this case are threefold. Firstly, the INTJ experiences their internal dialogue in an abstract fashion, and they have a natural proclivity towards the abstract in general. Think of the dominant dialogue as a kind of itch that you need to scratch, as an irresistible compulsion. The domain of the abstract is not optional for the INTJ. Because the INTJ is drawn towards the abstract, they are drawn towards the existential. They do not simply choose a portion of reality to identify with. No, the INTJ's internal dialogue is an act of reflection and reconciliation with reality as a whole. However, unlike their INFJ counterpart, the INTJ experiences less natural proclivity towards internalizing a kind of monologue. The INTJ engages their abstract dialogue in an altogether more limbic fashion. And as such, the second implication of the INTJ's introverted intuitive dominant function is its employment alongside their convergent auxiliary of introverted feeling. Because the INTJ's primary dialogue tends to be much more experiential. It tends to rely much more upon imagery, metaphors, relational substrate, than it does necessarily a long drawn-out internal monologue. Don't get me wrong, the INTJ still loves to employ introverted thinking alongside their introverted intuition, and indeed the topics that they do like to talk about often have a very abstract nature. Furthermore, the INTJ's introverted feeling is experienced very intensely. And if they do ever become tired out, they do tend to fall into a more dormant state whereby introverted intuition is engaged with a much more murky introverted thinking. And indeed, in these cases, the INTJ may even experience a kind of coldness, an absence of emotion, while they essentially take a break from the intensity of their convergent auxiliary introverted feeling. However, the primary dialogue of the INTJ, again that natural compulsion, is of a much more limbic nature. And in this sense, actually, the INTJ is the true INFJ out of the introverted intuitive dominance. Because insofar as their introverted intuitive dialogue is concerned, they are often engaged much more in a constant active relation to the world around them, and tend to experience their internal reality through oftentimes extremely vivid imagery, symbolism, scenarios. And indeed, the introverted intuitive world of the INTJ is oftentimes very colourful and very emotionally intense. And moving now on to the third aspect of their introverted intuition, the INTJ is in a constant state of self-transformation. The introverted intuitive dialogue of the INTJ is not only relating upon that which they perceive, finding meaning in the external logical world around them, even relating to the internal worlds of others, but also a constant process of adaptation to the emerging concept. Not in a simple adapt as you go along kind of way, but actually foreseeing where things are going and adapting their identity to the person they want to become in the future. And this is how the future tense orientation of the INTJ's introverted intuition manifests. They're consulting logical external reality, reflecting upon it and finding what is meaningful to them, charting out a future for themselves, a future in which they can have the maximal impact and find the most meaning, and constantly attempting to reconcile the activity with which they are engaged with the future version of who they are. And out of all of the 16 types, it is the INTJ who I see as the most limbically adaptive, because this type has the most capacity for very conscious and deliberate self-transformation, and they project that transformation into the future. The INTJ is not a detached type. They are not cold and analytical. They understand logic through relating themselves to it, and their goals are achieved through this very relational process, a kind of symbiosis between logical order and their own identity. So if you do consider your internal dialogue, even at its most intense, to be relatively detached and analytical, if your identity feels more concrete, or even a kind of immovable force pushing you forward, formed more perhaps by a past-oriented dialogue rather than a future projection, if you do not feel your identity is under your control, and as competent as you may be at it, if you feel like abstract dialogue, the encapsulation of all reality into a single internalized perception, is highly optional for you, and something you do not feel particularly drawn towards, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ, because the INTJ's dominant functions are introverted intuition with a convergent auxiliary of introverted feeling. And therefore not only are they drawn towards abstract, internalized, holistic understanding, but they are also highly self-transformative, and experience an internal dialogue much more limbic and metaphorical, symbolic, experiential, than say the altogether more cerebral dialogue of an INTP or an ESTJ. And in many ways these two words, introverted intuition, correspond much more to the INTJ's experience of reality than any other type, because oftentimes their introverted thinking is relatively unconscious, and therefore that which they know to be true is something rather experienced and felt than it is put into a kind of internal monologue. And therefore if you experience very little natural compulsion towards engaging the abstract, the existential equation, the conscious reconciliation of self with reality, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ, because of course many people can do these things, many people can think in a highly abstract way, but oftentimes the abstract is seen more as a kind of cherry on the cake, something which is amusing to entertain for a short period of time, before one's attention is, say, focused much more on something more pragmatic, something with immediate applicability. Furthermore, if you do not feel your identity is in a constant state of transformation, and if you are not constantly shaping and evolving yourself to the future that you anticipate, it is again very unlikely you are this introverted intuitive dominant INTJ. And this brings me neatly to the third sign you are not an INTJ. The INTJ, yes, they're an introverted feeler, but their introverted feeling is convergent. It is within the convergent auxiliary possession. All types have introverted feeling. All types can even experience introverted feeling consciously, and yes, I'm talking to you ESTPs and ENTPs. But it is the nature of the INTJ's introverted feeling that sets the type apart from the other 15 types. Because unlike the ESTJ and the ENTJ, the INFJ, for example, the INTJ does not experience their emotions as this kind of unyielding driving force. In fact, contrary to popular belief, the INTJ is not this relentless force of nature enacting change and innovation as they go, taking mastery in their stride and forging a career almost as happy consequence of them simply being themselves and doing what they do best. I mean, I don't find that a particularly well thought through or accurate type description in general. But if I was going to assign that description to any one of the 16 types, it wouldn't be the INTJ. I actually find the ESTJ, for example, corresponds much more closely to that kind of mastermind stereotype than the INTJ does. And this is not in any way, shape or form intended as a criticism of the INTJ, far from it. Because one of the most underestimated strengths of this particular type is the sheer amount of control they have over their emotions and their identity. And as I'm going to get to in a later portion of the video, their natural style of thought that they inherit as a result in reaction to the position of their introverted feeling. You see, the INTJ's primary dialogue is not nearly as cold and as systematic as it is often made out to be. Remember, this is an introverted intuitive we are talking about here. No, rather, the reason that INTJ is so oftentimes highly competent and adept at understanding and indeed given sufficient emotional reconciliation, mastering a subject that they choose to master, is actually done through an active relation. And just to fully map out the INTJ's cognitive stack, the INTJ perceives reality through their extroverted sensing oppositional function. This function, as I'm going to explore more thoroughly in a later portion of this video, is attached to an extroverted thinking divergent auxiliary. This is the authority function of the INTJ, and therefore the INTJ is gazing upon logic. They're gazing upon the interaction between external values and seeing how these values relate to one another. And through their internal dialogue, the INTJ begins to relate upon the object. They not only understand the values they are perceiving, but they go that additional step and relate upon those values. This is full understanding, because you have not only objectively understood something, but you have also integrated that understanding into who you are. And the INTJ goes a step further, because the more meaning they find in that which they perceive, the more they can proceed to master upon it. Because the INTJ is undertaking through a constant dialogue, a constant back and forth between objective logic and subjective logic, between that which they are perceiving and their identity. And it is because the INTJ has introverted feeling within this convergent auxiliary hyper-possessive position that they are able to decide what they relate to, what they find meaningful. And oftentimes the greatest challenge for an INTJ is not understanding on a cerebral level, as much as it is being able to constantly reconcile their identity with that which they are pursuing. And should an INTJ be unable to find meaning in that which they are pursuing, the entire thing becomes an effort of will. And furthermore, with their introverted feeling being in their convergent auxiliary position, the INTJ is not only possessive of their internal emotional world and their identity, but also extremely protective of it. And indeed, out of all of the 16 types, it is oftentimes the INTJ who will be least inclined to relinquish any amount of responsibility for their own emotions and who they are. This is not an area in which the INTJ likes to delegate. And while the ISTJ is similarly possessive of their convergent auxiliary introverted feeling, the introverted intuitive landscape in which the INTJ's introverted feeling resides is oftentimes so vast and kaleidoscopic and even overwhelming that it can actually be quite dangerous for the INTJ to relinquish any responsibility for their identity. Because it is the INTJ's identity that keeps them anchored within a sea of ongoing change. It is that control that INTJ has over who they are and what they find meaningful that allows the INTJ to be able to experience such an intense introverted intuitive feeling in a world without being lost within it. But it is also thanks to this introverted intuitive dominant function to which their introverted feeling is assigned that the INTJ is able to mold and adapt an identity that synergistically corresponds to everything they want to do. And as such, if your identity is not under constant surveillance and control, if you can even happily delegate your own emotional responsibility to other people, for example, allowing people to carry the weight of your emotions, even allowing other people to influence your identity, and find this identity in question to be much more static and immovable, and something you may even have little control of, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ. And furthermore, if you can just pursue and complete goals just because they seem like a good idea, if you can master things entirely for their own sake, and if finding emotional meaning in that which you perceive is not a prerequisite to your willingness to engage with it in the first place, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ. Because of course, an INTJ can still carry out a task without necessarily finding meaning in it. But when it comes to long-term pursuits, and particularly those which require additional levels of investment, going beyond that which is necessary, innovation, for example, the INTJ will oftentimes go through an extensive dialogue to ensure that particular thing is meaningful to them before they are willing to exert that additional amount of effort. Point number 4, just as the INTJ is a convergent feeler, and therefore having their introverted feeling convergent auxiliary within their direct control and supervision, being even highly possessive of that function, they are subsequently a divergent thinker. And honestly, this is a great way to tell the difference between a true INTJ and a person who is mistyped as one. And I really say this without any amount of venom because I get how easy it is to mistype as an INTJ. But all too many people who identify as INTJs seem to be incredibly opinionated, very happy to form conjecture, even in the absence of available evidence to support their claim. Not to mention oftentimes very attached to their opinions, and extremely combative even in the way they go about presenting their opinions and defending them against the conflicting opinions of other people. While the pseudo-INTJs will be those people making wild conjecture, generally getting angry at other people and calling other people names, while the true INTJs will generally be the people presenting evidence and maybe on occasion very hesitantly putting forward a cautious opinion, a cautious hypothesis formed upon the evidence in question. Because you see, while INTJs are introverted intuitive dominants, they have a proclivity towards the abstract, and they enjoy meaningful abstract discussion. It is actually pretty rare for an INTJ to be one of those intellectual theorists, particularly of the more combative ilk. Because yes, while many INTJs have an intellectual predisposition, being divergent thinkers, they tend not to actively construct their own theory. Any theory they do present is often a synthesis, an amalgamation of that which they have already learned and found to be true. Unlike INFJs, INTPs, ISTPs, ENTJs, the logic of the INTJ is not within their control. It is far less chaotic than those respective types. And therefore, indeed, the INTJ is one of the least likely types to form a wild conjecture and take to the stage defending that conjecture even in the absence of available evidence to support it. If you see a person employing logic in a chaotic way, forming conjecture after conjecture, happily creating wild theories to explain absolutely everything, in the absence of hard evidence to support their claims, it is very unlikely they are an INTJ. And this will spit in the face of what many people believe to be true, because time and time again you see various famous philosophers, theorists, intellectuals typed as INTJ, because it makes sense dichotomies-wise. They're introverted, intuitive thinking, judging types. Nobody can take that away from them. But while INTJ philosophers and intellectuals do very much exist, well, first of all, owing to the privacy of this type, they tend to seek the spotlight much less than others. And secondly, they are oftentimes much more cautious in putting forward a strongly held opinion. And if an INTJ does put forward a speculation, a hypothesis, an opinion of the non-limbic existential variety, it is very likely to be thoroughly researched and backed up by available evidence. And this is all because the INTJ does not create logic, they observe it. An argument presented by an INTJ will be comprised of primary and secondary sources, and it will be presented after thorough consideration and analysis. Because the INTJ is extremely cautious, and observing logic as they do rather than creating it, it is more typical for any argument the INTJ puts forward to be a presentation of what is already known and established. And every now and again a less cautious and risk-averse INTJ will put forward a strongly held opinion on that which isn't necessarily backed up by available data. But these are the exception and not the norm. And there is actually a serious advantage to this thinking style of the INTJ. Because with the energy that would otherwise be spent creating logic, the vast majority of the energy the INTJ directs towards thinking is put towards the effective observation of existing logic. And therefore it's not in the least bit unusual for an INTJ to actually take academic studies, for example, in their stride. Because that is a perfect example of the divergent thinking process. Of course, academic studies often involve, according to the subject of course, varying levels of convergent and divergent thinking. And forming your own opinion and speculation on top of existing data is very important. But because the INTJ is a divergent thinker rather than a convergent one, They can not only follow rules and existing structure extremely well and to the letter, but they can also very quickly understand any given system because they are putting energy into observing that system and subsequently relating upon it. And therefore the INTJ actually takes understanding in their stride. But despite this natural aptitude towards learning, towards quickly understanding and assimilating oftentimes very complex systems, most INTJs are actually extremely modest, heck even insecure about their intellectual capabilities. You may often hear the INTJ portrayed as arrogant, overly sure of themselves, but this is seldom what the INTJ actually experiences. And if they ever do put forward such a front, it is usually at an earlier age as a kind of defense mechanism. Don't get me wrong, of course, any person of any type can be arrogant, but it is not in the least bit unusual for an INTJ to have 1,000 qualifications, be surrounded by people telling them how incredibly competent and gifted they are, and still feel very modest about their abilities, even after mastering a dozen different subjects, still be hyper-aware of any given shortcomings that apply. The INTJ is not a naturally arrogant or opinionated type, and should an INTJ ever venture forth an opinion, it will oftentimes be very well considered and thoroughly researched. And as such, if you find yourself highly opinionated, if you find yourself chaotic in your logical patterns, be willing to just form conjecture and go with it, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ. And again, if you find yourself to be highly argumentative, taking to the spotlight, putting forward your opinions and conjecture as having their own innate worth, whether or not they're backed up by existing data, it is again very unlikely you are an INTJ. And following naturally on from point number 4, the 5th sign you are not an INTJ relates to an extroverted thinking authority function. Because yes, like many other types, the INTJ is a divergent thinker. But this divergent thinking function of the INTJ is not only more extroverted than it is introverted, but it is also occupying authority position. And therefore this is not a function easily suppressed, but rather a function that must be abided by, very much setting the agenda for the INTJ's dominant functions. Because unlike the ENTP, who has an introverted thinking authority function, the INTJ doesn't necessarily need to have a vivid internalized understanding of something before they can interact with it. Because oftentimes the internalization of the INTJ's logic is much more vague, relative to the degree to which they can bring it to consciousness from the dominant position. Rather, the INTJ is directed much more towards efficiency and optimization than they are internalized understanding. And furthermore, because it is extroverted sensing to which extroverted thinking is assigned in this instance, unlike the ISTJ and the ESTJ, the INTJ's need for optimization and efficiency is not directed across a broad landscape, but rather to a very specific portion of the external world that occupies the INTJ's attention. But should a component in the broader view impede the INTJ's ability to be efficient, for example, if they're not able to do their job efficiently because of, say, the suboptimal performance of other team members, the INTJ can find this extremely stressful. And with such a drive for efficiency, the INTJ does not actually enact order for its own sake, contrary to popular belief and of course relative to the individual and their upbringing. It is not unusual for an INTJ to actually have a relatively messy workspace. Not in the sense of things being in the wrong places. Of course, an INTJ would want to know exactly where things are. We're talking about efficiency after all. But rather, say, to give an example, if an INTJ was working on something throughout the day, and it required a lot of equipment to be out on the surface, the average INTJ would consider it extraordinarily inefficient to put all of the stuff away at the end of the day if they intend to work on it the very next morning. The INTJ would actually opt to save 60 to 120 minutes of work by leaving everything as it is. And that way the INTJ can finish working, perhaps recharge for half an hour to an hour before bed, have a cup of coffee in the morning and then continue to work away. That is an example of extroverted thinking efficiency. And of course that depends again upon the upbringing of the person in question. But the extroverted thinking authority of the INTJ proclivicates them to favour efficiency and industriousness even, over orderliness entirely for its own sake. But there is a second ramification of the extroverted thinking authority function, and this is a natural and innate respect for authority, qualification, the superstructures of the external world which have been proved to be effective. And while of course some INTJs would view it as somewhat of a necessary evil, there is a kind of natural respect for qualification, for the word of an expert. And even to some extent, in some cases, even a level of naive trust to someone who has earned a qualification in a certain subject. Because the use and reliance upon external credentials is sometimes more efficient than taking every single person's argument in turn, irrespective of their rank and qualification. And therefore, again, for the sake of efficiency, this isn't so much a type who distrusts authority, as much as it is a type who respects authority, rank, hierarchy, qualification, credential, as a means to separate trustworthy knowledge from that which is untrustworthy, or merely interesting. But there is, of course, some potential for naivety in some cases here, because sometimes a qualification or rank is assumed to have more inherent value than it actually does. And the degree to which an INTJ would fall into that particular trap would be relative to the degree to which they can suppress their authority function and use their thinking in a more convergent fashion in order to shape their own opinions and assess the rationale of another person's argument without necessarily defaulting to credential or authority. And therefore, if you consider yourself, somewhat efficient, if you consider yourself more experimental in your logic, I'd even say naturally distrustful of externalized logic such as hierarchies and authority. If you consider yourself more of a chaos junkie, for example, if your use of logic seems to alternate, for example, between precision 1 minute and sheer bombastic experimentalism the next, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ. And again, if you do not have that constant need for efficiency and to meet the standards imposed by a criteria in question, even seeing rules as things which are meant to be broken, it is again unlikely you are an INTJ. Bonus point, and if you're still with me so far, thank you, you are awesome. The INTJ has a highly unconscious extroverted feeling. Relative to the degree to which they can suppress their extroverted thinking authority function, the natural opposite of this extroverted thinking function, this is extroverted feeling, will be suppressed. However, do not make the false inference from this that the INTJ is cold, that the INTJ does not care about the external emotional atmosphere. This could not be further from the truth. While oftentimes the extrovert feeling is indeed unconscious, it is still within the INTJ's dominant stack. It is still a function they egoistically relate to. And therefore it is a function that they value. I mean, sure, just as with many types, particularly when the INTJ is tired, they can become somewhat blunt, somewhat cold. But oftentimes an INTJ absolutely hates to cause a negative emotional atmosphere. It makes them feel very uncertain, it makes them worry about what people are thinking of them. And it is not unusual for particularly more FE-activated INTJs to be incredibly socially competent. However, it is fair to say in the majority of cases, an INTJ will experience a certain level of dissociation from the external emotional world, and will often use a combination of introverted feeling and extroverted thinking in order to effectively make up for a lack of conscious extroverted feeling. And particularly in the more FI reconciled cases, an INTJ can actually be incredibly empathetic. However, generally speaking, an INTJ will be very cautious when interacting with an emotional atmosphere, and often even feel very insecure about their ability to give other people a good social experience. And just as a small aside, it's not unusual for an INTJ to even lack a degree of extroverted feeling expression, and may even switch between a very animated expression of emotion when talking about something they are interested in, and then, for example, between pauses in a sentence, suddenly switch to a much more emotionally expressionless demeanour, and all the while without really noticing when they were being emotionally expressive and not. So if you feel confident in your ability to observe the emotions of other people, if you only feel slightly uncertain as to what other people are feeling and expressing, as to what emotions you are conveying to other people, and indeed if you feel very secure in your ability to transmit emotions to other people, to convey what you are feeling to others, it is very unlikely you are an INTJ. And in particular, if the social information of the world around you seems to just grab your attention, if you feel a kind of natural pull towards any given social stimuli, it is again relatively unlikely you are an INTJ, because as keen as the INTJ is in observing logical external reality, they tend to feel much more naturally disconnected from external emotional social reality. And that concludes the video, so thank you so much for watching and I hope it was useful. If you know anybody who you think might benefit from the video, or just generally find it interesting, I highly recommend sharing it with them too. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button below, and if you haven't already done so, be sure to click that subscribe button too with the bell icon next to it, that way you can stay notified of future content. If you're interested in the fundamentals behind the terminology in CPT, I highly recommend checking out CPT ebook. And if you are in any way uncertain about your type, or just like to know how your type applies individually to you, I highly recommend checking out the CPT type service. And CPT is on Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the channel on a theory and not additional level, that would be massively appreciated. But of course, it goes without saying, I would appreciate your support and interaction and feedback over here as well. So that's all from me, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.